I was at a dinner party a few weeks ago, and the conversation turned, as it always does, to the state of the world. The consensus around the table was, well, bleak.
Mm-hmm. Familiar territory.
Totally. One person was convinced global poverty was getting worse. Another was certain that child mortality was still astronomically high in most of the world. Everyone just nodded along. It felt like we were all agreeing on this shared, dark, and dramatic reality.
Right. This sort of collective pessimism.
Well, exactly. And then I mentioned Hans Rosling. I brought up the data showing that actually extreme poverty has plummeted, that child mortality has fallen off a cliff, that most of the world isn't low income anymore.
And how did that go down?
The reaction was immediate skepticism, even a bit of annoyance. It was like I'd broken an unspoken rule.
Yeah.
It's a strange thing to observe.
Yeah.
People seem almost emotionally attached to the idea that the world is broken.
Yeah, Rosalind really hammered that point home.
He did. His whole argument is that this feeling, this instinct, is fundamentally wrong. But as I was making that case, I remembered a story I'd read that morning, a different kind of story. It was about communities in Somaliland, displaced by a drought so severe it had turned entire fields to dust.
Oh, okay.
And a really uncomfortable thought surfaced. What if our instincts are wrong about poverty, but terrifyingly right about something else?
That narrative, I think, captures the core tension we really want to tackle in this deep dive. It's what some call the progress paradox.
The progress paradox, right.
We have mountains of quantifiable data demonstrating extraordinary human gains in health, education, reducing extreme poverty, just like you said. Yet that emotional, pervasive, and pessimistic global outlook persists.
It really does.
So our mission really is to unpack the source of that conflict for you. Is the pessimism purely psychological? Is it, a cognitive error that warps our perception of the data?
Or is it something else?
Or is it that the metrics we traditionally use to measure progress are fundamentally incomplete? That they fail to account for the real planetary costs you mentioned, the reality of that Somaliland drought? We are diving into both sides here. The psychological mechanisms that keep us kind of hooked on bad news, and then these new metrics attempting to measure the planetary destruction occurring alongside those human gains.
So we need to figure out if our feelings are deceiving us or if they're actually picking up on a critical cost that the spreadsheets, well, they've historically just ignored.
Exactly. Are we being irrational, or are we sensing a deeper truth?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting exactly where that dinner party went wrong, the psychology bit. Why does that bleak worldview feel so persistent, almost satisfying sometimes, even when you show people overwhelming evidence of human improvement? Why are we so, emotionally resistant to good news?
Yeah, I think what you encountered there is the negativity bias. Sometimes it's formally called the negativity effect, and it seems to be deeply wired into our evolutionary past.
Negativity bias, okay.
The core definition is pretty powerful. Negative stimuli, whether they are thoughts, emotions, or events, they just have a greater and more lasting effect on a person's psychological state and cognitive processes than positive or neutral stimuli of equal intensity.
So basically, bad is stronger than good, even if they're technically equal.
Put simply,
Yeah.
the emotional weight of something bad far outweighs the emotional lift of something equally good.
Huh.
For our ancestors, this bias was probably a survival necessity. Think about it. Failure to spot danger, a negative outcome, could mean death.
Right. High stakes.
Missing an opportunity for pleasure, a positive outcome, well, that just meant missed comfort. Less critical for immediate survival.
So it's not just about noticing the bad things, it's that those bad things demand more of our mental resources, which in turn kind of reinforces them in our memory. It makes them stickier.
Precisely. Researchers Rosen and Roisman identified 4 key elements that describe how this bias operates within our cognition. The first one they call negative potency.
Potency. Okay.
This means that negative items are just inherently more salient, more impactful. They leap out at you, so to speak.
Like a warning signal.
Kind of. Think about interpreting changes in temperature, for instance. A negative shift. The temperature suddenly becoming severely cold or maybe painfully hot, that's often perceived more intensely. It demands immediate behavioral attention far more keenly than an equally large positive shift, like moving from merely chilly to perfectly warm.
I see. The severity, the potency of the potential threat is magnified.
Right. The cold requires finding shelter, building a fire. It demands mobilization, action.
That makes intuitive sense. What about the way we perceive future negative events? Does that differ too?
Yeah, and that leads to the second element, the steeper negative gradient.
Steeper negative gradient. Okay, what's that?
Our sources point out that this refers to how we perceive events across time or distance. Negative events are perceived as increasingly more negative. The dread or pain component escalates the closer one gets to them. And this escalation is much steeper than the corresponding increase in positivity as you approach an equally anticipated positive event.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Consider anticipating, say, a painful dental surgery versus anticipating a major vacation or a big celebration. The dread of the impending surgery, for most people, escalates almost exponentially as the date approaches.
Yeah, I can feel that just thinking about it.
Right. And that feeling far outstrips the maybe more linear increase in excitement for the party, even if both events were initially assigned the same emotional magnitude in your mind.
Wait, if I'm following, this implies the cognitive load required to sort of minimize or plan for potential harm is ramping up drastically, draining resources long before the event even occurs.
It does. It absolutely does. And this cognitive effort directly feeds into the third element, negativity dominance.
Negativity dominance.
Now, this is critical to understanding why your dinner guests might have ignored Rosling's data. Dominance acts as a kind of gestalt principle. When positive and negative elements are combined, even if the positives vastly outnumber the negatives, the overall interpretation skews dramatically negatively.
Ah, okay, so the whole picture is tainted by the bad parts.
The whole is often judged as more negative than the simple sum of its parts. It's like the negative casts longer shadow.
So the 100 global data points showing plummeting poverty are immediately outweighed by the one recent severe anecdote about the drought in Somaliland. The negative story just dominates the overall impression of the global state.
Absolutely. Because that one story of severe suffering carries a disproportional amount of effective weight. It just feels more significant.
Wow.
And finally, the fourth element is negative differentiation.
Differentiation, how so?
We don't just feel negative things more strongly. We also conceptualize and articulate them in more elaborate, complex ways than we do positivity. Our negative vocabulary is significantly richer and more descriptive.
Huh. I never thought about that.
Think of the dozens of words we use for fear or anxiety or pain compared to the words for happiness or contentment. There's just more nuance on the negative side.
It's true.
And this is consistent with what researchers call the mobilization minimization hypothesis.
Okay, could you elaborate on that hypothesis? How does it relate to our brain resources?
Sure. The mobilization minimization hypothesis basically suggests that negative events, because they signal potential threat or harm, require a greater immediate mobilization of cognitive and psychological resources to process and address.
Mobilization to deal with the threat.
Right. The brain has to spend more energy understanding the negative event, figuring out its cause, and developing strategies to minimize its consequences. Get ready, figure it out, reduce the harm.
And positive events don't trigger that same response.
Generally, no, because positive events usually require little to no immediate action. They're less diagnostically urgent, less critical for immediate survival. They simply don't generate the same level of resource allocation. It literally takes more brain power to process the bad stuff.
Which ensures it gets flagged and remembered for future survival. Makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Exactly.
But that is a powerful model for survival that seems to have maybe backfired in the modern information age. It suggests our brains are perfectly primed to be overwhelmed by bad news.
That's a great way to put it. Prime for overwhelm.
Let's look at how this manifests in our perception of other people and, in public discourse.
Yeah, social judgment and impression formation are classic areas where this bias shows up prominently. Negative traits disproportionately impact the final impression we form of someone.
Right, like you hear one bad thing about someone.
Exactly. Think about the paradox mentioned earlier regarding honesty. If you know someone who is generally honest but commits one or two significantly dishonest acts, they are often instantly reclassified as fundamentally dishonest. Their whole history of honesty doesn't seem to save them.
But the reverse is much harder. A historically dishonest person who performs an honest act doesn't immediately shed their negative reputation. They're still considered predominantly untrustworthy, usually.
Precisely. Researchers argue this happens because negative behaviors are often less frequent and less socially acceptable. They're violations of strong societal norms.
They stand out more.
Because they're less expected, negative behaviors become highly diagnostic of a person's true character. We feel more confident in an impression formed from negative traits because those traits stand out as indicators of someone's genuine underlying nature.
And the same principle extends directly into public attention and the media landscape.
Oh, absolutely.
Which means negative information becomes an economic commodity. It's an attention magnet.
It really is. Real-world evidence repeatedly confirms this. Bad news sells more papers, drives more clicks online. It's just how it works.
And even in fiction.
In literature, too.
Yeah.
Successful narratives almost always rely heavily on negative events, turmoil, conflict, to draw and hold the reader's attention. We are simply wired to pay more attention to the potential downside, the drama, the threat.
I recall reading about a very specific cognitive test used to measure this immediate processing difference, something about naming colors of words. Does that ring a bell?
Ah, yes. You're probably referring to the modified Stroop task. It's an excellent way to illustrate this cognitive drag, this interference effect.
Right, the Stroop task. How does the modified version work here?
Okay, so in the standard Stroop test, you're shown a word, like BLUE, written in red ink, and you have to say the color of the ink, so red, ignoring the word itself. It's harder than it sounds.
Yes, it messes with your brain.
In the modified version used to study negativity bias, participants are flashed words representing personality traits. Some positive, like kind, honest, some negative, like cruel, liar. And again, they're asked to quickly name the color of the ink the word is printed in.
Okay, same task, different words.
Exactly. And even though the meaning of the word is irrelevant to the task of naming the ink color, participants are significantly slower to name the color when the word itself is negative.
And what does that time difference, that delay, tell us?
The delay in response time demonstrates that greater cognitive attention was automatically devoted to processing the meaning of the negative trait, the potential threat signal, even when the participant was consciously trying to ignore it.
Wow, so it grabs your attention whether you want it to or not.
That automatic attention interferes with the unrelated color naming task. Furthermore, we see corresponding physiological responses too. Individuals exhibit greater orienting responses, things like larger increases in pupil diameter and heart rate, when encountering negative information compared to positive.
So our body and our brain are fundamentally wired to react more strongly, more immediately to the negative than the positive.
It seems so. It's a deeper response.
So if the media landscape consistently pumps out salient, memorable, and diagnostic negative events, because that's what grabs attention, our psychological hardware pretty much guarantees that we will internalize this negative narrative as the true state of the world, regardless of what aggregated, complex data sets might suggest about overall progress.
That's a very plausible outcome, yes. And this bias isn't just about general mood or media consumption. It seems to infiltrate our social structures, particularly politics.
How so?
Well, some research strongly suggests a correlation between a heightened inherent sensitivity to negative stimuli and certain political affiliations.
Really? Tell me more about that.
For instance, people identified in studies as being more sensitive to negative stimuli, more prone to threat perception, reacting more strongly to alarming images or sounds, tend to lean toward more socially conservative ideologies.
Why is that connection between threat sensitivity and conservative ideology often noted in these studies?
The sources suggest that a high sensitivity to threat might naturally predispose an individual toward ideologies that prioritize stability, clear social boundaries, hierarchy, and strong enforcement mechanisms. These are all things aimed at reducing perceived external or internal risks.
Okay, so the focus is on security and order.
Right. Rhetoric centered on danger, threats to social order, or the collapse of fundamental structures resonates perhaps more strongly because it directly addresses that heightened cognitive threat detection system.
And conversely?
Conversely, those measured with a lower innate negativity bias are often found to be more comfortable with, say, liberal policies that champion pluralism, flexibility, change, and acceptance of diverse social groups, even though those conditions might inherently carry perceived risks of conflict or unpredictability to a more threat-sensitive mind.
That provides a powerful sort of mechanistic explanation for the persistence of pessimism. It's a psychological tendency amplified by our information environment and maybe even linked to political orientation.
It's a complex interplay for sure.
But we need to pivot now to the second part of the paradox we started with. The unsettling possibility that the world is structurally broken, just maybe not in the way my dinner guest thought. If we step back from our brains and look at history, the Enlightenment era was founded on an incredibly optimistic view of progress. What was the central belief of that historical thesis again?
Ah, yes, the Enlightenment view. It was founded on what the philosopher G.A. Cohen termed the development thesis. This thesis is really a central pillar of Enlightenment optimism.
The development thesis.
It holds that productive forces, and that means things like technology, scientific knowledge, education, how we organize labor, possess an inherent tendency to develop and increase throughout human history.
So things naturally get better, technologically speaking.
That's the core idea. The fundamental promise was that this development would lead, almost inevitably, to greater material plenty, increasing individual liberation from necessity, and the progressive reduction of necessary human toil. It offers a very satisfying, kind of linear and optimistic trajectory for humanity.
And Cohen rooted this in human nature.
Yes, rooted in persistent facts about human nature, that we are rational beings, that we have intelligence, and that we seek to improve our material conditions through innovation when faced with scarcity.
That belief system is undoubtedly responsible for a lot of the dramatic progress we see in Rosling's data. I mean, the massive reduction in extreme poverty over the last 2 centuries is undeniable.
Absolutely. It powered incredible advancements.
But the terrifying irony, the other side of the coin, is that this very thesis, this drive for development, has arguably driven us headlong into the Anthropocene.
Precisely. That's the profound, inescapable conflict we face now. This seemingly inexorable development of productive forces has occurred simultaneously with the massive and accelerating destruction of non-human natural value. And it's now operating at a planetary scale.
We've leveraged technology and resources to improve the human condition, but the net cost seems to be a fundamental destabilization of the global climate and biosphere. Our progress for humanity is translating directly into structural destruction for nature.
Yes, a terrible trade-off.
And this brings us to the core philosophical crisis you mentioned, the judgment problem. If progress requires an all things considered judgment, how on earth do you weigh, say, a 50-year increase in global life expectancy against the complete loss of functioning rainforest ecosystems? How do you even start?
That is the ultimate ethical and practical hurdle, isn't it? Determining whether overall all things considered progress actually exists requires balancing 2 fundamentally different and often competing sets of values: human flourishing, health, wealth, knowledge, and non-human natural value, biodiversity, climate stability, clean air, and water.
And the problem is they're not measured in the same units.
Exactly. Our sources emphasize that this creates a problem of pluralism and incommensurability.
Okay, explain that difference again, the incommensurability part.
Incommensurability means that these 2 sets of values, human well-being and natural value, cannot be reliably compared or traded off according to a single common metric or currency. You can measure human welfare in dollars or life years or literacy rates. You can measure environmental stability in parts per million of CO2 or species extinction rates per year.
Right. Different scales, different meanings.
But there is no rational, objective exchange rate between, say, a unit of human literacy and the intrinsic value of a wetland ecosystem. Because we lack that common yardstick, rational disagreement about the existence of overall progress is probably expected to persist indefinitely. There's no single right answer.
So if I value human health gains above all else, I might rationally conclude that, yes, we are progressing. But if I assign overriding importance to maintaining pre-Anthropocene ecological stability, I might just as rationally conclude that we are regressing massively.
Exactly. Both positions could be internally consistent based on different value priorities. And this is compounded by the ethical distinction often made regarding non-human natural value, that it holds intrinsic value.
Intrinsic value. This is critical, you're saying.
Very critical. Intrinsic value means the forest, the species, or the stable climate is valuable simply because it exists, separate from its instrumental value, its utility to humans, like providing oxygen, filtering water, or supplying timber.
So it's valuable even if it doesn't directly serve us.
Correct. If a value is purely instrumental, it can potentially be substituted or priced. Maybe we can find another way to filter water or put a dollar value on timber. But if a value is intrinsic, its destruction represents an absolute ethical and practical loss that cannot be rationally factored into that old Enlightenment calculation of progress. It breaks the equation.
The Enlightenment thesis, designed to be our liberation, has driven us toward a system where our very metrics for success are fundamentally incomplete. We needed new tools, new measurements, just to begin assessing that planetary trade-off.
Yes, absolutely.
This brings us to the efforts to actually measure this cost, starting with the UN's massive framework, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs.
Right. The SDGs, adopted by UN member states back in 2015, represent the world's most comprehensive attempt so far to build that necessary dashboard you're talking about. They're expansive, universal, technically non-binding policy objectives built around 17 goals and a whopping 169 targets.
169 targets. Wow.
Yeah, and they aim explicitly to integrate environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainability, encapsulated by that central promise to leave no one behind.
How do they compare structurally to their predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and what were the immediate critiques of their design?
Well, the MDGs, which ran from 2000 to 2015, were focused primarily on poverty reduction in developing countries, with just 8 goals, much simpler.
More targeted.
The SDGs, by contrast, are universal. They apply to rich and poor nations alike, and dramatically expanded to those 17 goals and 169 targets. And this sheer volume was immediately criticized. Yeah, critics called the vast number of targets a mess, arguing this scale diluted their political steering effects. Instead of providing clear, transformative direction, the complexity kind of allowed countries to pick and choose the targets that were easiest for them to meet, or maybe just those that aligned with existing national policy anyway. Cherry picking, basically.
So they were comprehensive on paper, but maybe too complex to be truly transformative in practice. What about the central philosophical flaw you mentioned, particularly concerning the environment?
The main environmental weakness, according to critics, is that the SDGs fail to truly integrate planetary integrity as the foundational component. It's still kind of treated as one pillar among equals.
Not the base layer.
Exactly. Only 3 goals, Goal 13, climate action, Goal 14, life below water, and Goal 15, life on land, are primarily environment-focused. Critics point out that the protection of planetary integrity is often treated as an instrument to achieve human prosperity rather than being recognized as an end in itself, a prerequisite for everything else.
And you mentioned Goal 8 creating tension.
Furthermore, yes, the inclusion of Goal 8, which promotes sustained, inclusive economic growth, puts the framework in direct philosophical conflict, arguably.
How does Goal 8 create that tension? Economic growth sounds good, usually.
It creates an inherent structural contradiction. If the framework maintains the idea that sustained global economic growth is foundational, which is still the core tenet to the old Enlightenment thesis, it makes it incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible, to achieve the deep ecological sustainability required by Goals 13, 14, and 15, especially if we haven't yet achieved absolute global eco-economic decoupling, which, well, we haven't.
Decoupling growth from impact.
Right, and studies confirm that countries consistently prioritize socioeconomic goals like Goal 1, no poverty, and Goal 8, economic growth, over the environmental goals. They often use the SDGs to legitimize existing national growth policies rather than driving the systemic shift the planet actually demands.
So the dashboard exists, but it's imperfect and maybe prone to self-serving interpretation. If the SDGs are structurally flawed in this way, we really need a better measurement, a truly planetary-centric metric that adjusts our existing measures of human progress based on the destruction caused to achieve it.
Exactly. And this realization drove the call for a revolution in metrics, a need to move beyond simple national averages and toward measures that actively account for these planetary pressures.
So what came next?
Well, the Human Development Index, the HDI, has long been a powerful signaling device for human flourishing. It combines metrics for health, life expectancy, education, years of schooling, and standard of living. Gross national income per capita.
Right. The HDI was already a big improvement over just using GDP because it factored in capabilities beyond just income.
Absolutely. And importantly, the income component in the HDI uses a logarithm. This isn't just a statistical trick, it's a philosophical statement. It acknowledges the principle of diminishing marginal utility.
Meaning $1 is worth more to someone poor.
Exactly. $1,000 means exponentially more to a very poor person than it does to a very rich person. So as income rises, its contribution to the overall HDI score increases at a progressively slower rate. It values gains for the poor more highly.
Okay, that's a crucial refinement.
However, even with this refinement, the standard HDI still fails to factor in the fundamental ecological cost required to achieve that level of development. It measures human gain, but not planetary pain. That's why we now have the experimental, but I think highly insightful, Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index, or PHDI.
The PHDI. Okay, so this attempts to complete the picture. It takes the HDI score we know and penalizes it based on the country's environmental footprint. What are the 2 specific pressures used for this critical adjustment?
The PHDI is a composite index that applies penalties based on two primary measures of planetary pressure. First, carbon dioxide emissions per capita, and second, the country's material footprint per capita.
Okay, we understand carbon emissions pretty well, but the material footprint sounds like a more sophisticated concept. It needs detailing. What exactly does the material footprint measure?
Yeah, the material footprint is crucial because it accounts for externalization, for where stuff really comes from and goes. It measures the total amount of raw material extraction. Think fossil fuels, biomass like timber and crops, metal ores, construction minerals, the total extraction attributed to satisfy a country's domestic final demand.
Domestic final demand. So what the country actually consumes?
Yes, regardless of where it was produced. This is distinct from simply measuring domestic resource use within its borders. If a wealthy country consumes, say, a television made in another nation, the material resources extracted to produce that television, wherever they came from globally, are attributed to the consuming country's material footprint.
Ah, I see. So it captures the true global cost of consumption, not just what's dug up locally.
It captures the true cost of consumption globally.
Exactly. This means that high-consumption nations, which have often externalized much of their manufacturing and the associated ecological impact to the developing world, finally have to reckon with the total environmental cost of their lifestyle in this metric.
That is precisely the point. And when you apply these adjustments, when you take points away from the HDI score for the massive unsustainable environmental costs associated with that development, the progressive narrative of human development absolutely shatters for the wealthiest nations. It's quite a shock.
Let's hear that shocking data. What is the scale of this necessary reevaluation? How big are the changes?
It is truly staggering. Of the more than 60 countries that qualify for the very high human development category in the traditional HDI, only 10 remain in that top category after the planetary pressures adjustment is applied.
Only 10 out of over 60. That's huge.
It is. The majority of the world's most developed nations suffer massive drops in their index value and their world rank.
Give us the most dramatic examples. What does this adjustment reveal about the structural unsustainability of these top-tier economies?
Okay, consider Luxembourg. They rank very high on the traditional HDI, suggesting a model of successful human development, right?
Yeah, usually near the top.
However, after the PHDI adjustment, their HDI value drops by a catastrophic 46.0%, nearly half.
Wow, 46%.
This single adjustment causes their world rank to plummet by 131 positions. That shift demonstrates pretty starkly that nearly half of their measured human progress appears structurally reliant on externalized ecological destruction. They're essentially buying their quality of life with planetary credit they don't actually have.
A 131 position fall is not a minor statistical correction. It's like an indictment of the entire national model of development itself. What about other major industrialized economies? Australia, the US?
The data is consistent across many high-income countries. Australia, another nation usually ranked very high, sees its HDI value drop 26.3%. causing it to fall 72 ranks.
70 rank.
Canada drops 22.4% and falls 40 ranks. The United States drops 22.5%, resulting in a fall of 45 ranks.
So similar magnitudes of correction.
Yes. These dramatic adjustments really drive home the point that the high quality of life enjoyed by citizens in many of these countries comes at a massive, untenable price for the global ecosystem and, frankly, for future generations. The pessimism we talked about earlier might be rooted in a cognitive bias, but the PHDI reveals that a deeply sober, critical assessment of our current trajectory is actually justified by the data once you account for the planet.
And what happens to countries with lower overall HDI scores? Those may be already operating more within planetary constraints. Do their scores change much?
That's the other side of the story. Their scores barely budge, confirming that their development, while currently lower in traditional HDI terms, is far more sustainable from a planetary pressure perspective. India, for example, only sees a minor 2.9% drop in value and falls just 8 ranks.
Okay.
Bangladesh drops just 1.1% and falls 9 ranks. They are achieving their current level of development with a relatively minimal planetary footprint, comparatively speaking.
Which proves that the problem isn't really development itself, but the type of hyper-resource-intensive development pursued by the wealthiest nations.
That's certainly what the data strongly suggests. It's the model, not the goal of improving lives.
This profound disparity highlights the whole issue of global carbon inequality, which the PHDI research brings into sharp focus. Who is actually responsible for the bulk of the emissions driving this planetary destruction? Where is it concentrated?
The inequality is extreme. The sources detail that the wealthiest 1% of individuals worldwide emit 100 times as much carbon dioxide annually as the entire bottom 50% of the global population combined.
100 times, let that sink in. The top 1% versus the bottom half of humanity.
It's a staggering statistic. This single figure might be the most critical realization in this entire deep dive. The problem isn't primarily population growth in poor countries or generalized human advancement across the board. It appears to be extreme concentrated affluence at the very top.
And the source of those emissions reinforces this class divide, right? The type of emissions produced by the bottom 50% is fundamentally different from the top 1%.
That's right. For the bottom 50%, the vast majority of their emissions, around 73%, are linked directly to basic consumption needs. Heating, cooking, essential goods, local transport. They are using resources primarily to meet the necessities of life and, hopefully, escape poverty.
So if we focus solely on asking poor people to reduce their already minimal consumption, we are completely missing the scale and source of the problem. What about the top 1%? Where do their emissions come from?
For the global top 1%, the source of their emissions is far more complex and pervasive. A growing and significant share of their total emissions, about 50% of their total, amounting to an average of 73 tons of CO2 equivalent per capita per year.
73 tons per person.
Yes. And about half of that is embedded not just in their luxury consumption habits like flights and large homes, but critically in their investments and accumulated wealth.
Investments, how does that work?
Their financial capital flows into companies and industries. If those investments are in fossil fuels, resource-intensive industries, high-carbon infrastructure projects, then the emissions generated by those activities are increasingly being attributed back to the investors. And this share of investment-related emissions has been rising steadily over the past 4 decades.
Wait a minute. If half of the top 1% carbon footprint is tied up in their investments, in financial capital that's actively funding high-carbon activities, doesn't that fundamentally render behavioral change campaigns aimed at the average consumer, change your light bulbs, almost totally ineffective at addressing the core systemic problem?
It absolutely suggests that, or at least points to where the biggest leverage point is. It reveals a structural problem that current policy and traditional sustainability goals, like the SDGs, largely miss or fail to adequately address.
So what's the implication?
The implication is that the solution demands an urgent, non-negotiable decoupling of financial activity and investment from environmental destruction. The evidence suggests that while the rise of the middle class in emerging countries has certainly increased generalized emissions, the really substantial growth in emissions recorded by the top 1%, driven by both their increased consumption and their wealth and investment streams, must be the primary focus for any meaningful, high-impact planetary pressure reduction strategy.
This whole journey has offered a really stark reframing of the progress paradox we started with. We began with the question of why we feel so pessimistic, even when some human progress data, like Rosling's, looks objectively good on paper.
And we found that the pervasive negative global outlook may well begin as a psychological feature, that negativity bias, which naturally prioritizes bad diagnostic information and makes it more memorable, potentially keeping us locked into a narrative of collapse or decay, sometimes missing the bigger picture improvements.
But then, when we move beyond just psychology and apply an objective, planetary-aware lens to that same progress, we find that a deeply sober, highly critical assessment of progress, especially in wealthy nations, is quantitatively justified. The dramatic adjustments seen in the Planetary Pressures-Adjusted HDI prove that the high human development achieved by the wealthiest nations is often structurally reliant on unacceptable environmental destruction and massive externalized costs.
The dilemma we face is now clearly structural. Human development, as currently pursued by the leading economies, is fundamentally eroding the natural capital it relies upon. The evidence strongly suggests that achieving true progress that can be universally sustained across the globe and ethically defended for future generations, requires not just managing human needs, like the SDGs try to do, but urgently, radically decoupling economic advancement from planetary pressures.
And that starts where the impact is greatest.
And that must start by addressing the disproportionate resource use and, crucially, the investment-related emissions generated by the wealthiest groups worldwide. The data demands that we stop asking only if things are getting better for humans according to old metrics and start asking the much harder question. Is our current version of better compatible with the long-term existence of a habitable planet itself?